May 9, 1945, Boston Navyyard, Massachusetts. The steel deck beneath Captain Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann's boots felt impossibly solid after weeks of constant motion, the submarine's rolling pitch replaced by the unwavering stability of American concrete. Morning light reflected off the oily waters of Boston Harbor, illuminating the forest of masts and superstructures that stretched toward the horizon. Destroyers, cruisers, supply vessels, and repair ships in quantities that seemed to violate some fundamental law of maritime possibility. Hartmann stood at attention in his salt-stained, oil-streaked uniform, hands clasped behind his back, waiting to meet the American Admiral who had summoned him. Behind him, 37 surviving members of U-853's crew stood in similar posture, exhausted, frightened, and utterly bewildered by the reception they had received since their submarine had been depth-charged to the surface 3 days earlier off Block Island. The sound that dominated Hartmann's awareness was not the harbor's maritime cacophony, but something more subtle and more unsettling. The clicking of typewriters echoing from nearby administrative buildings. Steady, mechanical, relentless, the sound represented bureaucracy functioning with industrial efficiency, paperwork being generated at scales he had never imagined possible. Each click was documentation, was procedure, was the sound of American institutional machinery processing the captured, cataloging prisoners, maintaining records that testified to individual existence and organizational accountability. The sound communicated order, system, and resource depth that could afford to document everything rather than treating prisoners as anonymous units to be expedited through minimal processing. Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid emerged from the headquarters building flanked by 2 junior officers, his uniform pressed with creases so sharp they seemed capable of cutting, his bearing projecting authority tempered by what Hartmann would later recognize as professional restraint. Kincaid paused at the top of the steps, studying the assembled U-boat crew with an expression Hartmann could not interpret. Not contempt, not triumph, but something more complicated that included elements of both recognition and what might have been respect for adversaries who had fought until their submarine was destroyed around them. Then Kincaid descended the steps with measured pace, approached to within conversational distance, and rendered a salute that military protocol demanded between officers despite the circumstances of their meeting. Hartmann returned the salute automatically, his mind racing to comprehend the gesture's implications. Everything his training had taught him about capture, the propaganda warnings of torture, the horror stories of Soviet treatment of prisoners, the expectation that defeat meant humiliation and brutality was being contradicted by this American admiral saluting a captured enemy submarine commander, as if Hartmann retained some measure of professional dignity despite total defeat. The cognitive dissonance was so profound that Hartmann found himself questioning whether this was psychological warfare, some elaborate deception designed to extract intelligence before the real treatment began. But Kincaid's expression suggested something different, something Hartmann had no framework to understand. That American naval culture included traditions of professional courtesy that persisted even toward enemies who had spent years trying to kill American sailors. Kincaid spoke in English, his words translated by a German-speaking lieutenant who stood respectfully aside. The admiral acknowledged the U-boat crew's surrender, confirmed they would be treated according to Geneva Convention standards, and informed them they would be processed as prisoners of war and eventually transferred to camps in the continental United States. He asked after wounded crewmen's condition, was informed that American Navy medical personnel had already treated the injured, and nodded acknowledgement. Then he did something that would haunt Hartmann for the rest of his life. Kincaid expressed condolences for the crewmen killed when U-853 was depth-charged, acknowledging their deaths with the same solemn recognition he might have offered for American casualties, treating enemy dead as worthy of mourning rather than as satisfactory outcomes of successful combat operations. As this exchange concluded, and the U-boat crew was led away for formal processing, Hartman glanced back at the Admiral standing on the pier, silhouetted against the harbor's industrial landscape. The clicking of typewriters continued, audible through open windows, the sound of documentation proceeding without interruption, of systems functioning with mechanical regularity regardless of individual dramas being enacted. That sound and the memory of an American admiral saluting a defeated enemy and expressing condolences for German deaths would become the symbolic center around which Hartman's understanding of the war, his enemy, and ultimately himself would be reconstructed over the months and years that followed. This moment, the formal, respectful processing of captured German naval personnel by American authorities committed to Geneva Convention standards, exemplified a profound asymmetry between how democratic and authoritarian military cultures treated defeated enemies. For German U-boat crews who had fought in the Battle of the Atlantic, men trained in one of the Kriegsmarine's most elite services and indoctrinated with Nazi propaganda about American weakness and barbarism, the experience of fair treatment in American captivity became an involuntary education in the practical differences between societies organized around fundamentally different principles. What they encountered challenged not just their tactical understanding of the enemy, but their entire ideological framework about the nature of power, the relationship between strength and cruelty, and what military professionalism could mean when divorced from totalitarian ideology. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, one must first comprehend the world German submariners inhabited before capture. The U-boat service represented the Kriegsmarine's elite, men selected for technical competence and psychological resilience necessary for submarine warfare's unique demands. Training was rigorous, emphasizing not just technical skills, but the psychological conditioning required to function in confined spaces during extended patrols, to maintain operational effectiveness despite constant danger, and to accept casualty rates that would have broken less cohesive military units. U-boat crews developed fierce esprit de corps, bonding through shared dangers, and the knowledge that their service was statistically likely to end in death. By war's end, approximately 75% of German submariners who served were killed, one of the highest casualty rates of any military service in any nation. Captain Lieutenant Hartman had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1936, attracted by naval tradition and professional opportunities rather than ideological fervor. His path to U-boat command had been conventional: training at Naval Academy, service on surface vessels, selection for submarine school, and gradual progression through ranks as he demonstrated technical competence and leadership capability. By 1943, when he assumed command of U-853, he was a veteran officer who understood submarine warfare's tactical intricacies and had survived numerous patrols when so many contemporaries had been killed. His professional identity was rooted in naval tradition, in the Kriegsmarine's self-conception, as military professionals distinct from Nazi Party ideology, though this distinction was always more aspirational than actual, given the military's deep complicity in the regime's crimes. U-853's final patrol in April-May 1945 had occurred during the war's last days, when Germany's strategic situation was hopeless and U-boat operations had become essentially suicidal missions launched from Norwegian bases because German ports were lost or unusable. Hartman had received orders to patrol American waters off the eastern seaboard, to attack Allied shipping despite overwhelming Allied anti-submarine superiority, and to continue operations regardless of Germany's impending collapse. The patrol was operationally futile. Allied convoys were heavily defended, air coverage was comprehensive, and the Atlantic had become a death trap for U-boats. But orders were orders, and German military culture demanded obedience even when strategic logic had evaporated. On May 5, 1945, U-853 torpedoed and sank the Collier Black Point off Point Judith, Rhode Island, killing 12 American merchant sailors. It would be the last American merchant vessel sunk by U-boat action in World War II, a final pointless act of violence launched by a doomed submarine in a war already lost. American anti-submarine forces converged on U-853's position with overwhelming force, destroyer escorts, patrol craft, and aircraft conducting coordinated search using radar and sonar technologies that made concealment nearly impossible. For 48 hours, U-853 evaded detection through a combination of tactical skill and desperate maneuver, but the outcome was inevitable. On May 7th, depth charges from USS Atherton ruptured the submarine's hull, forcing an emergency surface that exposed the boat to direct fire from multiple vessels. The surfacing U-boat presented American forces with tactical choices about how to conclude the engagement. German submarines had reputation for fighting to the end, for refusing surrender even when defeat was certain, and American crews had learned wariness about approaching damaged U-boats that might detonate scuttling charges or launch desperate torpedo attacks. But as U-853 wallowed in the swell, clearly doomed and no longer capable of effective resistance, the American vessels ceased fire and established perimeter positions while calling for Hartmann to surrender. The message was transmitted by signal lamp and radio in German and English: abandoned submarine, surrender crew, expect treatment according to international law. Hartmann faced the decision that no commander wants to make, whether to continue fighting when fighting meant certain death for his crew, whether to scuttle the submarine and risk crew members' lives in the sinking, or whether to surrender and accept captivity. German naval tradition emphasized fighting spirit and resistance to the end. Nazi propaganda had spent years warning that surrender to Americans meant torture and death. But Hartmann also bore responsibility for his crew, men who had followed orders, who had fought competently, and who deserved the chance to survive if survival was possible. He made the choice that saved most of their lives. He ordered the crew to abandon ship, scuttled U-853 to prevent its capture intact, and surrendered to American forces who recovered survivors from the cold Atlantic waters. The first moments of captivity established patterns that would persist through subsequent processing and imprisonment. American sailors recovered German submariners from the water with professional efficiency, providing medical attention for injuries, warm clothing to replace wet uniforms, and hot food, coffee and sandwiches, simple fare, but delivered without hesitation or commentary. German expectations of immediate brutality, of revenge for American merchant sailors killed by U-boats, of treatment matching the propaganda warnings, none materialized. Instead, captured submariners found themselves aboard American vessels being treated with what seemed almost like hospitality, as if they were distressed sailors rather than defeated enemies. This initial treatment reflected American naval culture's complex relationship with enemy submariners. American sailors understood submarine warfare's brutal nature, knew that U-boats had killed thousands of Allied merchant seamen, and harbored no illusions about the enemy they had fought. But American naval tradition also included respect for mariners who faced the sea's dangers, recognition that submarine service was particularly hazardous, and professional acknowledgement of adversaries who had fought competently, even in an evil cause. The combination of these factors, professional respect, naval tradition, and institutional commitment to Geneva Convention standards, produced treatment that German prisoners found incomprehensible within their ideological framework. The journey from Point Judith to Boston Navy Yard took 18 hours aboard USS Atherton, the destroyer escort that had delivered the decisive depth charge attack. Hartmann and his crew were confined in spaces converted for prisoner holding, but the confinement was humane. Adequate ventilation, regular meals, access to sanitation, and medical personnel checking on wounded crewmen throughout the night. The destroyer's crew performed their duties with professional detachment, neither fraternizing with prisoners nor subjecting them to abuse. The atmosphere was tense but not hostile, defined by military protocol rather than personal animosity. During this transit, Hartman experienced his first sustained exposure to American material abundance. The destroyer itself was evidence: relatively new construction, well-maintained equipment, comfortable crew quarters, visible through passageways, and most strikingly, the casual plenty of supplies and resources. Food was served in quantities that seemed excessive to men accustomed to U-boat rations. Coffee was abundant, available seemingly without limit. The crew wore clean uniforms, had adequate clothing for weather conditions, and displayed none of the threadbare improvisation that had characterized German military logistics by 1945. The destroyer's commissary, briefly visible as prisoners were moved through the ship, held supplies in quantities that would have sustained a U-boat for months: canned goods stacked floor to ceiling, dry stores in industrial quantities, fresh provisions in refrigerated spaces. This abundance was casual rather than ostentatious, presented without commentary or apparent awareness that it might seem remarkable. American sailors treated their material circumstances as normal, as baseline expectations of how military logistics should function. For German submariners who had spent years operating in conditions of increasing scarcity, who had watched rations decline and supplies deteriorate as Germany's strategic situation collapsed, this casual American abundance communicated messages about relative industrial capacity and societal wealth that no propaganda or intelligence briefing could have conveyed as effectively. The evidence was immediate, material, and undeniable: American. Military forces operated from resource foundations so deep that even routine logistics exceeded what German forces had possessed at their peak. Arrival at Boston Navyyard on May 9th introduced the U-boat crew to American naval infrastructure at even more overwhelming scale. The Navyyard occupied hundreds of acres along Boston Harbor, included multiple dry docks, extensive repair facilities, administrative buildings, warehouses, and support infrastructure that testified to industrial capacity devoted to maritime power. Dozens of vessels filled the harbor, some under repair, others being provisioned for deployment, still others being decommissioned as war's end approached. The sheer quantity of ships, the visible efficiency of operations, and the systematic organization of activities communicated that this single naval facility possessed capabilities exceeding entire German naval establishments. The clicking typewriters, audible as prisoners were marched from pier to processing facility, became the auditory symbol of everything Hartman was learning about American institutional culture. The sound represented bureaucracy functioning at industrial scale, paperwork being generated for every prisoner, documentation being maintained with meticulous attention to individual detail. Each German submariner was photographed, fingerprinted, medically examined, interviewed, and issued prisoner identification documents, a process requiring hours but conducted with systematic efficiency that suggested this administrative machinery processed prisoners routinely rather than as exceptional challenge. The processing paperwork itself revealed American institutional priorities. Forms documented each prisoner's name, rank, service history, medical conditions, personal effects, and multiple other categories of information. The level of detail seemed excessive to Germans accustomed to more expedient military administration, but the documentation served multiple purposes. It provided accountability, ensuring prisoners were tracked and their treatment recorded. It facilitated intelligence gathering about German military organization and capabilities, and it established legal records that protected prisoners' rights under Geneva Convention provisions. The clicking typewriters producing this documentation were more than just administrative procedure. They were evidence of institutional commitment to lawful treatment, of systematic accountability, and of resource depth that could afford to document everything rather than taking bureaucratic shortcuts. Rear Admiral Kincaid's formal meeting with the U-boat crew, conducted on the pier outside headquarters building, represented the culmination of this initial processing. Kincaid was not required by protocol to personally address captured enemies. That duty could have been delegated to subordinates. His choice to meet the submariners himself, to render military courtesies, and to express condolences for German deaths reflected American naval culture's complex traditions regarding enemy seamen. Kincaid had commanded naval forces throughout the Pacific War, had fought Japanese forces with ruthless effectiveness, and harbored no illusions about Axis criminality. But he distinguished between military organizations and individual combatants, recognized professional competence even in defeated enemies, and believed that how victors treated the vanquished revealed something essential about their own values. For Hartmann, Kincaid's salute and expression of condolence created cognitive dissonance so profound it approached psychological crisis. Everything his training and indoctrination had taught him suggested that American officers would be contemptuous of defeated Germans, would revel in their victory and humiliation of enemies, would treat captured submariners with the brutality that Nazi propaganda had promised. Instead, an American admiral demonstrated respect for military professionalism, acknowledged German dead as worthy of mourning, and conducted the entire exchange with dignity that suggested defeat need not mean dehumanization. The contrast between expectation and reality forced Hartmann to question what else he had been wrong about, what other propaganda narratives were lies, and what this fair treatment revealed about the fundamental nature of his enemy. The transfer to prisoner of war camps in the continental United States occurred through systematic processes developed during years of managing hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners. German submariners were transported by train from Boston to Camp Blanding in Florida, a journey taking 3 days and providing extended exposure to American civilian infrastructure and societal prosperity. The train cars, while designated for prisoner transport and secured by military guards, were passenger cars with seats, windows, and basic amenities. Prisoners received regular meals during the journey: sandwiches, fruit, coffee, and rations that exceeded both quantity and quality of what they had eaten during their final months in Germany. But the landscape visible through train windows communicated even more than the food. The American heartland through which they traveled appeared untouched by war. No bombed cities, no destroyed infrastructure, no visible evidence of the total mobilization that had characterized German society. Towns and cities looked prosperous. Farmland was productive. Industrial facilities operated without apparent disruption from strategic bombing. The contrast with Germany's devastation was absolute. Where German cities were ruins, American cities thrived. Where German industry had collapsed, American factories hummed. Where German civilians starved, American prosperity seemed casual and unremarkable. Camp Blanding, which would house Hartmann and most of U-853's crew for the war's duration and into the post-war period, exemplified American POW camp organization. The facility occupied thousands of acres of Florida pine forest, housed thousands of German prisoners, and operated with bureaucratic efficiency that reflected systematic approach to managing large prisoner populations. The camp included barracks for housing, mess facilities serving regular meals, medical clinics staffed with adequate personnel and supplies, recreational facilities including sports fields and libraries, workshops where prisoners could engage in productive labor, and administrative infrastructure, maintaining detailed records on every prisoner. The conditions reflected American adherence to Geneva Convention standards and pragmatic recognition that well-treated prisoners were easier to manage, more likely to provide intelligence, and less likely to attempt escapes or cause disruptions. Prisoners received adequate food, approximately 2,800 calories daily, more than German civilians were receiving in occupied Germany. They had access to medical care, educational programs, religious services, and recreational activities. They could send and receive mail through international Red Cross channels, maintaining connections with families despite imprisonment. The systematic provision of these services required enormous resources, food, medical supplies, administrative personnel, and infrastructure, all devoted to maintaining humane conditions for enemy prisoners while American forces continued fighting in the Pacific. For German submariners accustomed to U-boat service's extreme deprivations, Camp Blanding's conditions seemed almost luxurious. Hartman found himself sleeping in a bed with clean sheets, eating regular meals at tables in mess halls, and having leisure time for reading, sports, or other activities. The contrast with submarine life, weeks underwater in cramped spaces, constant danger, inadequate food, and the knowledge that each patrol might end in death, was so extreme that some prisoners initially suspected the conditions were temporary, that real captivity would begin once this initial processing period ended. But as weeks became months, as the war in Europe ended and then the Pacific War concluded, the conditions remained consistent: adequate food, humane treatment, systematic administration, and throughout, the clicking of typewriters, documenting everything with bureaucratic thoroughness. The clicking typewriters became Hartman's constant auditory companion, audible from administrative buildings, from the camp headquarters, from offices where clerks processed paperwork with mechanical efficiency. The sound represented American institutional culture's commitment to documentation, accountability, and systematic procedure. Every aspect of camp operation was documented: prisoner assignments, work details, medical treatments, disciplinary actions, mail sent and received, educational programs attended, religious services conducted. The paperwork accumulated in filing cabinets, creating archives that testified to individual prisoners' existence, and treatment, providing accountability that protected prisoners from arbitrary abuse and ensured institutional standards were maintained. This bureaucratic documentation was more than administrative burden. It was evidence of institutional values prioritizing lawful conduct, systematic process, and accountability. In German military culture, particularly in the chaotic final years of war, documentation was often abandoned in favor of expedient action. Prisoners were processed minimally, if at all, and accountability mechanisms had been systematically undermined by totalitarian governance. American insistence on proper documentation, even for enemy prisoners in remote camps, revealed institutional culture that functioned through procedures and systems rather than through arbitrary authority and personal whim. The camp included German prisoners from various services and capture circumstances, submariners, Luftwaffe personnel, Wehrmacht soldiers, merchant mariners. This mixing of services created opportunities for prisoners to compare experiences and recognize patterns in American treatment. The consistency emerged clearly. Regardless of service or capture circumstances, prisoners reported similar experiences of initial fair treatment, systematic processing, adequate camp conditions, and throughout, bureaucratic documentation, clicking away on typewriters. The pattern suggested that American conduct toward prisoners reflected institutional policy rather than individual commanders' discretion, that the fair treatment was systematic rather than coincidental, and that American military culture included genuine commitment to Geneva Convention standards. Educational programs in the camp introduced prisoners to information systematically denied by Nazi propaganda. American authorities screened films showing concentration camp liberations, provided access to newspapers reporting on the European War's conclusion, and conducted orientation sessions explaining the occupation of Germany and the democratic reforms being implemented. These educational efforts were explicitly designed to undermine Nazi ideology, to prepare prisoners for return to a democratically reformed Germany, and to demonstrate Allied war aims included German society's transformation rather than its destruction. Hartmann participated in these programs with mixture of resistance and grudging recognition. The concentration camp footage devastated him. The skeletal survivors, the mass graves, the gas chambers and crematoria, the systematic murder implemented with industrial efficiency. He had known vaguely about concentration camps, had heard rumors of brutal treatment of Jews and other targeted populations, but had accepted official explanations that camps were detention facilities for enemies of the state. The liberation footage revealed something completely different: systematic genocide implemented with bureaucratic thoroughness, medical facilities corrupted into killing centers, and human suffering at scales that exceeded imagination. The recognition that Germany had committed these crimes, that the nation he had served had built industrial murder facilities, forced psychological reckoning that shattered remaining ideological certainties. The clicking of typewriters provided ironic counterpoint to Hartmann's processing of this information. American bureaucracy documented everything: prisoner education, film screenings attended, discussions conducted, all typed up and filed away in records that testified to the re-education program's systematic implementation. The same institutional impulse that maintained meticulous records of prisoner treatment also documented efforts to reshape prisoners' ideological understanding, to prepare them for return to transformed Germany, and to ensure that American conduct toward prisoners aligned with stated values about democracy, rule of law, and individual dignity. As months passed and prisoners adjusted to camp routines, relationships developed between captors and captives that transcended simple guard-prisoner dynamics. American personnel staffing the camps were soldiers performing assigned duties, often uncomfortable with their role as prison guards, generally decent in their personal dealings with prisoners, and willing to engage in basic human interaction despite language barriers and circumstances. Prisoners learned English, guards picked up German phrases, and communication gradually improved through sustained contact. The relationships remained bounded by military protocol and security requirements, but within those boundaries, genuine human recognition occurred. Guards and prisoners acknowledged each other as individuals rather than abstract enemies. Hartmann observed these interactions with analytical attention, trying to understand what they revealed about American society and values. The American Guards were not professional soldiers in German sense. They were conscript citizens, temporarily in uniform, representing cross-section of American society rather than warrior caste. They came from various backgrounds: farmers, factory workers, students, small business owners, and they brought civilian values and sensibilities to their military service. They treated prisoners as human beings deserving basic decency unless given specific reasons to do otherwise. They followed rules and procedures rather than exercising arbitrary authority. They seemed genuinely uncomfortable with cruelty or abuse, as if such behavior violated personal values rather than just military regulations. This civilian character of American military culture contrasted fundamentally with German military tradition, emphasizing warrior ethos, unquestioning obedience, and subordination of individual to institutional imperatives. American soldiers maintained civilian identities even in uniform, expected to return to civilian life after service, and approached military duties as temporary obligations rather than defining life commitments. This civilian orientation shaped how they treated prisoners. They saw captured enemies as people in unfortunate circumstances, rather than as categorical enemies deserving punishment. They maintained baseline human decency because their civilian values demanded it, and they implemented Geneva Convention standards not just because regulations required it, but because their societal values supported treating people fairly even in asymmetric power relationships. The war's end in August 1945 created new uncertainties for prisoners. Germany had been defeated, occupied, and divided among Allied powers. The Nazi regime was being dismantled, war crimes tribunals were beginning, and German society was undergoing forced transformation. Prisoners' eventual repatriation depended on multiple factors: need for labor in rebuilding Germany, individual security vetting to identify war criminals or committed Nazis, and coordination between Allied authorities managing occupation zones. The timeline remained uncertain, but American authorities communicated that repatriation would occur systematically, that prisoners would not be held indefinitely, and that the goal was eventual return to reformed Germany rather than permanent detention. During this period, Hartmann experienced gradual transformation, from resistance to reluctant acceptance of American narratives about the war and post-war order. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent: concentration camp documentation, testimony from liberated prisoners, comprehensive records of Nazi crimes. The material prosperity and institutional competence of American society was undeniable based on direct observation. The fair treatment prisoners had received contradicted propaganda warnings completely. The systematic nature of American conduct, documented, accountable, generally adhering to stated standards, demonstrated institutional culture fundamentally different from Nazi authoritarianism's arbitrary brutality. The clicking of typewriters continued throughout this transformation, providing constant auditory reminder of American institutional culture. Forms were filed for every prisoner's repatriation processing, medical records were updated, security vetting was documented, and all of it was typed up and preserved in filing systems that testified to bureaucratic thoroughness. The sound had become so familiar that Hartmann barely noticed it consciously, but it remained symbolically significant, evidence of systems functioning systematically, of accountability being maintained, of democratic institutions operating through procedures rather than through personal authority. Hartmann's repatriation came in spring 1946 as part of a group of naval personnel being returned to the British occupation zone in northern Germany. The process was systematic: final medical examinations, documentation review, orientation briefings about conditions in occupied Germany, and administrative processing that produced paperwork documenting every stage. He boarded a transport ship in Norfolk, Virginia, sailed to Bremerhaven, and was released to British military authorities, who processed him through additional screening before releasing him to civilian status. The Germany he returned to was devastated beyond recognition: cities in ruins, industry destroyed, infrastructure collapsed, population traumatized and starving. But it was also beginning transformation from totalitarian dictatorship to democratic society, forced by occupation but enabled by Germans themselves, who recognized that their nation required fundamental reformation. The years that followed brought Hartmann into post-war reconstruction, into the difficult work of building democratic institutions in a society traumatized by Nazism's catastrophic legacy. He worked in civilian maritime industry, helped rebuild German merchant marine, and participated in the gradual process of German society confronting its crimes and reconstructing its identity. The experience of American captivity remained formative throughout these years. The fair treatment he had received, the professional respect Admiral Kincaid had demonstrated, the systematic bureaucracy clicking away on typewriters documenting everything, all provided models for what democratic institutions could achieve, how lawful conduct could be maintained even in asymmetric power relationships, and how societies could organize themselves around principles of accountability and individual dignity. The clicking of typewriters in American POW camps, that sound which had initially seemed merely bureaucratic annoyance, came to represent something profound in Hartmann's understanding: the sound of democratic institutions functioning through systematic procedures, the audio signature of accountability and documentation, the mechanical embodiment of values prioritizing lawful conduct and individual recognition. In West Germany's democratic reconstruction, similar sounds would echo through government offices, businesses, and institutions as German society rebuilt itself on foundations that included rule of law, bureaucratic accountability, and systematic documentation. The typewriters clicking in those post-war German offices descended spiritually, if not literally, from the American typewriters that had documented Hartmann's captivity, had maintained records testifying to fair treatment, and had preserved evidence that democratic societies could adhere to their stated values even toward defeated enemies. As Hartmann aged and reflected on his life, he returned often to that moment on Boston Navy Yard's pier when Admiral Kinkaid had saluted him and expressed condolences for German dead. The gesture had seemed incomprehensible at the time, a violation of everything propaganda had taught him to expect. But decades of perspective revealed its significance. Kinkaid had demonstrated that strength and fairness were not mutually exclusive, that victors could treat vanquished with dignity, and that professional respect could transcend national enmity. The salute had been military courtesy, but it had also been recognition of shared humanity, acknowledgement that even enemies could recognize each other's fundamental worth, and demonstration that American power included restraint, rooted in democratic values. The typewriters that had clicked through Hartmann's captivity fell silent as technology evolved. Electric typewriters replaced mechanical ones, computers replaced typewriters, and documentation transformed from paper files to digital records. But the principle remained unchanged. Democratic institutions required systematic documentation, accountability demanded records, and fair treatment necessitated evidence that could be preserved and reviewed. The clicking of keys continues in different forms, creating the digital paper trails that testify to governmental and institutional conduct, that provide accountability against arbitrary authority, and that embody democratic values about transparency and lawful conduct. In the end, the fair treatment that German U-boat crews received from American captors revealed fundamental truths about the difference between democratic and authoritarian societies, not primarily differences in material prosperity, though those mattered, but differences in institutional values, in relationships between power and principle, and in commitments to treating human beings with dignity even when practical necessity did not demand it. The American Admiral's salute, the clicking typewriters documenting prisoner treatment, the systematic provision of adequate food and medical care, the educational programs preparing prisoners for return to democratic Germany, all testified to societal values that recognized individual worth, maintained accountability even in asymmetric power relationships, and understood that how victors treated defeated enemies revealed something essential about their own character and commitments. The sound of typewriters clicking in American POW camps was the sound of democracy documenting itself, of accountability being maintained, of bureaucratic systems ensuring fair treatment rather than enabling abuse. It was the sound of American institutional culture functioning according to stated principles rather than abandoning them when convenient. And it was the sound of a message being transmitted to defeated enemies, that democratic societies possessed not just superior material resources, but also institutional values and practices that deserved respect and perhaps even emulation. That clicking echoed through post-war reconstruction, through the democratic transformation of West Germany, and through the broader Cold War competition between democratic and authoritarian alternatives. It persists today in the sounds of government offices and institutions in democratic societies, in the documentation and accountability that distinguish lawful from arbitrary governance, and in the continuing effort to ensure that power serves justice rather than merely serving itself.